Hey guys, tonight we are going to take a quiet stroll through history and end up in a tomb that should have been nothing but dust. Instead, it offered something closer to a bizarre warranty 2,000 years, and still in surprisingly good condition. Inside lies Lady Dai, also known as Sinjui, a noblewoman from the Western Han dynasty, whose body has baffled scientists, wowed historians, and made the rest of us feel very insecure about our skincare routines. Do you dare find out how someone from 2 millennia ago can look more intact than leftovers you forgot in the fridge last week? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you shared your location and the time where you are listening. Midnight in Toronto, early morning in Sydney, maybe a lazy afternoon in Buenos Aires. Together, we make a constellation of little lanterns across the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Western Han dynasty is where our story begins. Picture an empire just getting comfortable with itself, like a college freshman who finally figured out laundry. The Han rulers had stabilized after centuries of warfare, rolled out standardized coins with neat square holes in the middle, and made sure everyone was writing in the same script, so official documents didn't look like competing fonts on a bad PowerPoint slide. Changsha, where Lady Dai lived, was buzzing with market life. Mulberry leaves stacked for silkworms, bundles of grain, fermented wine in clay jars, and kids dashing between stalls with the same reckless energy of modern mall shoppers on Black Friday. To live in the Han was to live with order. But it wasn't just order in the marketplace or in government paperwork, it was cosmic. The Han believed heaven and earth mirrored each other. If the emperor behaved, the stars stayed put. If the emperor misstepped, heaven practically subtweeted the mistake with comets and eclipses. Lady Dai, tucked inside her luxurious courtyard, lived in a world where every gesture had cosmic weight. Eat too much duck? Maybe your arteries clog. Maybe the stars frowned. It was all connected. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The Han treated death not as a goodbye, but as a housewarming party in a different neighborhood. Families built tombs like furnished apartments. Clothing, lacquerware, food, and even makeup came along for the ride. Imagine moving to a new city, and your parents send you off not only with pots and pans, but with a lifetime supply of snacks and a spa kit. This time the destination was eternity. Lady Dai's family was no different. When she passed, they went into overdrive to make sure she was ready. Her tomb at Mawangdui had layers upon layers of care, literally. 4 coffins nested like Russian dolls, sealed with resin, surrounded by clay and charcoal to keep things dry. The result? A fortress of stillness that managed to keep her body in better shape than most frozen dinners. Her family didn't know they were engineering the archaeological equivalent of a time capsule, but here we are. The Han also believed the soul had 2 parts, the Hun, which ascended, and the Po, which stayed with the earth. To guide the Hun, they painted elaborate banners showing the journey upward. Lady Dai rising gracefully toward celestial beings, flanked by suns and moons. To comfort the Po, they filled her tomb with food, robes, cosmetics, and music. Basically, the Han made sure no version of your soul felt neglected, something modern airlines could definitely learn from. So picture it. Her courtyard at dusk. Servants folding silk robes as carefully as origami. Musicians plucking strings in practice. Incense coils smoking in lazy spirals. Some of these actions were for the present moment, yes, but many were rehearsals for eternity. In their minds, she would rise again somewhere else, needing her robes, her food, her music, her comforts. Death was simply a relocation package, not an eviction notice. And because they believed this so strongly, they went to extremes. Artisans carved beams, polished lacquer until it gleamed, tied silken knots with ritual care. Family members whispered prayers, hoping their devotion would reach across the veil. They had no idea that their grief, multiplied by their meticulous sealing, would resist time itself. What they thought was preparing Lady Dai for forever actually prepared her for us. Her tomb did not simply preserve faith, it preserved flesh. And that is where our journey tonight truly begins. With a woman who was mourned and cherished, placed carefully into a fortress of silence, and who somehow endured to meet us. But before we open that coffin, before we let time's exhale wash over us, we should first meet Lady Dai in life. After all, what's the point of a miracle preservation if we don't know the person who was preserved? So, Now that we've taken a cautious peek into the silence of her tomb, let's rewind the lanterns of time and meet Lady Di while she was still alive. Because, before she became the world's most famous "Why is she still so soft" mummy, she was a woman with an address, a schedule, and some very relatable life choices, most of which involved eating well and moving as little as possible. Lady Di lived during the Western Han Dynasty, roughly 2 centuries before the birth of Christ, when the empire was flexing its muscles and showing off its ability to bring order out of chaos. Her husband, Li Kang, was the Marquis of Dai, a mid-level official in Changsha. That meant she had status, servants, silk, and more lacquerware than any modern kitchen shelf could handle. If Amazon Prime had existed, she would have been a platinum member. Her home life looked nothing like the average Han farmers, who spent long days bent over rice paddies. Lady Di's daily rhythm was closer to something you'd expect from a high-end wellness influencer minus the green juice. Breakfast might arrive in ornate black and red lacquer bowls, steamed grains, fresh fruit, maybe a cut of pork seasoned with imported spices. Midday entertainment could be a troupe of musicians performing on zithers, or dancers swirling silk sleeves that rippled like waterfalls. And if she felt a draft, there was always an attendant ready with a freshly perfumed fan. Her wardrobe was, in a word, dazzling. Imagine racks of robes dyed with cinnabar reds, deep indigos, soft jades, and warm golds. Each silk garment embroidered with patterns of cranes, clouds, and flowers, as if the entire natural world had signed up to live in her closet. For big events, she would layer robes upon robes, until the effect was less getting dressed, and more wearing a small ecosystem. The shimmer of those silks in lamplight was described by later historians as almost liquid, but luxury leaves footprints, and her body, when examined centuries later, told the truth. She loved food a little too much, and exercise a little too little. Physicians in the Moknyin Chin Chambemuis discovered she was obese by today's medical standards, with clogged arteries, high blood pressure, and a weakened heart. In short, Lady Di had the classic signs of what we might now call the couch potato lifestyle. Except instead of couch cushions, she had embroidered silk pillows, and instead of Netflix, she had entire orchestras. Yet, this doesn't make her less fascinating, it makes her more human. Think about it. We all have a comfort food we return to when we're stressed. Hers just happened to be lacquer-plated banquets of meats, fruits, and wine. We all skip workouts now and then. She simply skipped most of them. The last meal she ever ate, revealed by the melon seeds found in her stomach, wasn't some elaborate imperial dish, but a slice of refreshing fruit on a summer night. Suddenly, she feels less like a distant noblewoman, and more like that friend who says, "No, I don't want dinner, but yes, I'll have dessert." Beyond indulgence, there was duty. Being the wife of a marquis wasn't all silk sleeves and fruit platters. Appearances mattered. Alliances mattered. Every banquet was a networking event. Every robe a political statement. If your garment had the wrong embroidery, someone might interpret it as a jab at their clan. If the food was too lavish, it looked arrogant. If it was too modest, it looked cheap. Lady Di had to balance these subtle cues the way a modern politician balances sound bites. And even at home, the expectations continued. The Han valued ritual, how you received guests, how you spoke to your husband, how you instructed your servants. All of it was observed, judged, remembered. If Instagram influencers live under the tyranny of likes, Lady Di lived under the tyranny of ritual. Every moment had to look right, feel right, and send the correct signal to those watching. Still, her life contained joy. Picture her seated in a shaded garden pavilion, leaning on a carved cane, watching peonies unfold in the heat. Musicians plucking strings in the background, attendants bringing chilled wine. She may have sighed about her aching back or her shortness of breath, but she also smiled at dancers, traded private jokes with her husband, or stroked the hair of her son when he came running to her. Luxury and frailty intertwined, as they always do. And here's the thing. Because her tomb preserved her so perfectly, we know these details not from imagination alone, but from her actual body. Her spine showed the pain of sitting too long. Her organs bore the mark of overindulgence. Her skin still hinted at the softness she cherished in life. Archaeologists sometimes call her the best preserved mummy in the world, but what they really uncovered was a body that told its own autobiography. So, when we meet Lady Di in life, she is not just a name or a mummy. She is someone who loved fine food, adored silks, and endured the quiet weight of duty. Someone who lived richly, died too soon, and accidentally became the world's most famous time traveler not through technology, but through preservation. But as the music in her garden fades and the lanterns are snuffed one by one, her body begins to falter. Physicians gather with their scrolls of herbs and exercises, attendants whisper anxiously, and her family braces for the moment when comfort can no longer mask fragility. And that, you and I must follow her into the final days, where a last meal of melon becomes not just a snack, but a closing chapter. When we left Lady Dai, she was reclining in her shaded pavilion, surrounded by silk, music, and all the comforts of Western Han aristocracy. But even embroidered pillows cannot soften the weight of illness forever. Tonight, we follow her into those final days, where every shallow breath carried the hush of inevitability. The physicians were the first to notice. Imagine them unrolling their silk scrolls, each one marked with diagrams of herbs, breathing exercises, and acupuncture points. They would check her pulse, tilt their heads with that professional frown that hasn't changed much in 2,000 years, and murmur to one another. The Marquis' wife grows weaker. Perhaps they prescribed warming broths, or gentle stretches to restore balance, or specific herbs meant to calm the heart. But none of it could undo the years of indulgence written into her arteries. In those last weeks, attendants moved with an urgency they usually reserved for festival preparations. Silk robes were folded with extra care, as if to remind themselves she might still rise to wear them. Incense burned longer. Her son, perhaps not yet ready to understand the full weight of loss, hovered near her couch, restless but quiet under the stern gaze of tutors. Her husband, Li Kang, no doubt faced his own storm of worry. For him, this was not only the loss of a wife but the unravelling of a household's rhythm. And Lady Dai herself, we can only imagine, but her body speaks. The autopsy 2 millennia later revealed lungs that had struggled, veins narrowed like overwalked paths, a heart that had beaten too hard for too long. She must have felt the shortness of breath, the pain in the chest, the fatigue that turned every movement into labor. Each shallow inhale was a reminder that life's luxuries had come at a cost. There is one detail that stands out, both tender and haunting: her last meal. Archaeologists found melon seeds in her stomach, proof that she had eaten fresh fruit shortly before she passed. Picture it a humid summer evening, the air heavy and hard to breathe. Someone offers her slices of melon, cool and sweet, the juice refreshing against the heat. She accepts, savoring one last taste of summer. Not a lavish banquet, not an elaborate feast, but something simple, comforting, human. In that final sweetness, she reminds us that even noblewomen face the end with ordinary hungers. Her family did not have the luxury of time to grieve immediately. As soon as her breathing stilled, the machinery of ritual began. The Western Han believed the dead must be cared for as diligently as the living. Mourning was not just an emotional act, it was a logistical one. The Marquis and his son summoned artisans, carpenters to shape coffins, lacquerers to paint them, priests to conduct rites, and attendants to begin assembling the hundreds of objects that would accompany her into eternity. Imagine the scene: carpenters smoothing timbers, the sound of chisels ringing in the hot air, lacquerers bending over basins of pigment, layering the glossy reds and blacks onto planks, servants carrying bundles of silk, cosmetics, and food offerings into storerooms, ritual specialists chanting, marking the calendar, aligning the timing so that Lady Dai's passage matched cosmic harmony. Every gesture was deliberate, each one meant to ease her journey beyond death. And though these preparations were grounded in belief, they also carried love. Every robe folded, every vessel filled, every prayer whispered was an expression of devotion. Her family was determined that she would not travel alone, that she would be as comfortable in the afterlife as she had been in life. Even in farewell, they wrapped her in abundance. But here's the irony: what they thought was preparing her for another world ended up preparing her for ours. The meticulous sealing, the layers of coffins, the careful placement of clay and charcoal, these choices, born of grief and faith, would create a time capsule that outlasted empires. Picture now the evening of her burial. The courtyard is filled with mourners in white, the color of sorrow. Drums beat low, steady as a heartbeat. Incense thickens the air. Her body, wrapped in layer after layer of silk, is lowered with reverence into the waiting coffin. One lid closes, then another, until 4 coffins encase her. Resin seals the seams. Clay is tamped down. Charcoal spread thick. The chamber becomes a fortress of silence. Above, the earth is pressed firm, the mound smoothed, grass planted, The world resumes its rhythm, while Lady Dai begins her long vigil in darkness. Dynasties will rise and fall. Wars will rage. Emperors will be forgotten. And yet, beneath that hillside, she remains waiting, untouched, until the 20th century cracks her silence open. But before we climb down into that tomb with archaeologists, before we gasp at what they found, we must first explore the architecture of her resting place, the design of silence that accidentally defeated time. The tomb of Lady Dai was not just a grave, it was architecture as devotion, carpentry as theology, and engineering as an accidental rebellion against time itself. To understand why her body endured when so many others turned to dust, we have to descend with her into the layered fortress her family built, plank by plank, seal by seal. Picture a hillside in Mawangdui, the summer heat pressing down, artisans sweating as they cut timbers thicker than a man's arm. This was no shallow pit with a few planks thrown over it. The builders dug deep, nearly 20 meters into the earth. The shaft they carved resembled a vast open wound in the hillside, wide enough to hold what was essentially a buried house. When they lined it with thick wooden planks, painted and lacquered for durability, the tomb became a chamber designed not to rot but to resist. Then came the layers. Around the coffin chamber they packed white kaolin clay, smooth and heavy, sealing every gap. Over that they poured thick bands of charcoal, black as ink wash, meant to drink in moisture and keep the chamber cool. Together, these layers acted like guardians, clay shielding from water, charcoal swallowing dampness, earth pressing down to hold it all firm. Above them, soil was packed tight again, until the hillside looked unchanged, hiding its secret. Inside, the heart of the tomb was a masterpiece of ritual carpentry. 4 coffins nested like Russian dolls, each one fitting perfectly into the next. The innermost coffin was painted and lacquered, its surface gleaming even in lantern light, ready to cradle Lady Dai herself. Around it, another coffin, then another, until the outermost formed a wooden fortress. Resin was brushed into seams until no breath of air could slip through. The result was an airtight capsule where time lost its grip. But the tomb was more than coffins, it was rooms. Storerooms flanked the chamber, each stacked with objects meant to serve Lady Dai in eternity. One room was filled with lacquerware, hundreds of bowls, trays, boxes, painted in deep vermilion and black, their patterns curling like vines and clouds. Another held garments, silk robes folded neatly in stacks, their embroidered cranes and flowers waiting in stillness. Cosmetics were placed at her side mirrors, powder boxes, oils for the skin. Instruments too, zithers and flutes, ready to play for her spirit. It was as if her home life had been carefully miniaturized and packed into the tomb, like a moving kit for forever. And above it all, laid like a ceiling for her coffin, was the great T-shaped silk banner. Its colors remained vivid even to their raids, blacks, whites that survived centuries of darkness. At the bottom of the banner, mourners cluster around her coffin. In the middle, Lady Dai herself appears, rising with attendants. At the top, celestial beings welcome her, flanked by suns and moons. This was not a decoration, it was a map of death as passage, sorrow as ascent, eternity as destination. The silence of the tomb must have been overwhelming once the last artisan left, once the last torch flickered out. Imagine that moment, the chamber sealed, clay tamped, charcoal spread, earth pressed down, darkness absolute, air unmoving, a silence so complete that it held steady for 2,000 years. Not even insects could intrude, not even water could seep in. What the family intended as piety became the most advanced preservation system the world had never planned. Here's the irony. None of this was designed to impress future scientists. It was designed to comfort a soul, to honor a wife, a mother, a noblewoman. And yet, by layering wood, clay, charcoal, and silk, they built something no laboratory has managed to replicate since. They engineered an accident that became a miracle. And so Lady Dai lay there, wrapped in 20 layers of silk, encased in coffins, surrounded by offerings, resting in a chamber of stillness. Above her, dynasties rose and collapsed. The Tang painted murals, the Song wrote poetry, the Ming built walls, the Qing fought rebels. The world outside her tomb shifted endlessly, but inside, time was defeated. Centuries later, when modern workers dug into that hillside for an air raid shelter, they broke into this silence. The chamber exhaled for the first time in 2 millennia, and what it revealed astonished the world. But to see that memento feel the shock of archaeologists staring into a coffin that refused to obey history, we have to step forward to the 20th century. Imagine the hillside of Mawang Dui in the early Mukngin Chin Trambe Muis. Long after dynasties had fallen silent, the Cultural Revolution rumbled through China, and local workers were ordered to dig an air raid shelter into the slopes. Picks struck soil, shovels scraped stone, and no one expected more than hard labor ahead. And then, one day, the earth betrayed its secret. At first, it was timbers. Great beams emerged from the soil, far older than anyone alive could remember. Then lacquer boxes, still gleaming faintly through the dirt. Word spread quickly, and soon archaeologists descended on the site, lanterns swinging as they lowered themselves into the yawning pit. For them, it was like falling down a well of centuries. The deeper they dug, the stranger it became. 4 coffins stacked one inside the other, seams sealed so tightly it took days to pry them apart. Each layer was like peeling back time, each lid removed a step further into history. Dust should have awaited them, perhaps bones if they were lucky. But when the innermost coffin opened, time itself seemed to gasp. There she was, Lady Dai. Not a skeleton, not the dry husk of a mummy, but a woman whose skin still yielded to touch, whose limbs could still bend at the joints, whose hair was still fine and black. Her veins were visible, her organs intact. Around her body pooled a dark, slightly acidic liquid, a fluid no one could identify with certainty. The archaeologists stared, hands trembling, as if they had intruded on someone only recently asleep. One can imagine the silence in that chamber, broken only by whispers. This is impossible. In a world that expected crumbling bones, Lady Dai presented herself as though she had been waiting all along. Reverence overcame fear. Some bowed instinctively, others simply stood in awe. Science and history had collided with mystery, and mystery had won the first round. News traveled fast. Scientists from across China rushed to Changsha to examine her. They treated her body like both patient and relic, studying every detail. Her arteries told of heart disease, her liver of overindulgence, her joints of long hours spent seated. The seeds of melon in her stomach revealed her last meal. They charted her ailments with precision, as though she had checked into a hospital 20 centuries too late. But the marvel was not only her body. The silks around her were intact, their threads still shining. The lacquerware was polished as though set out yesterday. The great silk banner, folded above her, unfurled with colours still bold and alive. It was as if the tomb had held its breath, waiting to show the world not decay, but a snapshot of life in the Western Han. Visitors who came later described the experience in hushed tones. Standing before her, they said, was not like looking at an artifact but like meeting a person. Some felt awe, some unease, but all felt the same pull. Time had collapsed, and here was someone who should not be here, yet was. For her family, 2 millennia ago, all of this was meant as devotion. For scientists, in the 20th century, it became a revelation. And for us, tonight, it is a reminder that history is not always about what disappears, it is also about what endures against all odds. But the discovery only deepened the mystery. Why her? Why not her husband and son, buried in tombs just nearby, whose bodies turned to dust like everyone else's? What made her chamber succeed where theirs failed? To answer that, we must leave the archaeologists' astonishment and step into the laboratories, where scientists puzzled over airtight coffins, chemical fluids, and questions that have never found a final answer. So, let's step into the quiet laboratories where the astonishment of archaeologists turned into the furrowed brows of scientists. Lady Dai had been lifted from her coffin, wrapped carefully, and delivered into the hands of doctors who could not quite believe what they were seeing. Imagine a pathologist leaning in, scalpel in hand, pausing as though waiting for the body to suddenly sit up and protest. 2,000 years, and yet she still looked alarmingly recent. The first enigma was the liquid. Dark, slightly acidic, it had filled her coffin like a mysterious soup. Some researchers suggested it was a preservative mixture, brewed deliberately by ancient mortuary specialists. Others thought it was simply groundwater, altered by the chemistry of clay and resin. Still others whispered about traces of mercury, a substance known even then for its purifying qualities. And yet no consensus emerged. The fluid remained inscrutable, a riddle in a jar. Then there were the coffins themselves. 4 layers of wood, lacquered and sealed with resin, pressed tight as though time had no invitation. Around them, charcoal and clay buffered against water and air. The depth of the tomb kept the temperature steady, cool, even in Changsha's humid summers. Together, these elements created a microclimate so stable it seemed designed by accident or by genius. But if this was genius, why was it not repeated for her husband and son? Their tombs lay nearby, built with care, and yet their remains crumbled to dust. Was it chance? Or was Lady Dai the beneficiary of a technique whispered among specialists, and then lost when dynasties collapsed? Medical examiners shook their heads in disbelief. They found her organs still in place: lungs, liver, heart, stomach. They traced her arteries like rivers, still holding their shape. They identified her blood type. They concluded with confidence that she had died of heart failure, brought on by obesity, high blood pressure, and vascular disease. Imagine the irony. Physicians in the Mukngin Chin Trumbe Muis diagnosing a patient who had missed her appointment by 20 centuries. But with every answer came another question. Why had bacteria not thrived? Why had the liquid not evaporated? How could silk, lacquer, and flesh coexist without decay? Explanations multiplied: airtight seals, unique soil chemistry, lost embalming formulas, but certainty never arrived. Lady Dai remained a paradox, the most studied mummy in the world, and yet still the least understood. And perhaps that is the point. In a century where science prides itself on explanations, Lady Dai continues to whisper that not everything yields. Some mysteries are meant to accompany us, not to be solved but to be carried. She is not just flesh preserved, she is wonder preserved. And while doctors and scientists puzzled, her tomb offered another kind of treasure. Scrolls of silk, bearing texts on medicine, astronomy, philosophy. These writings, no less enduring than her body, revealed how the Western hand thought about health, cosmos, and eternity. To understand Lady Dai's full gift, we must step into the realm of her manuscripts and objects, where ink and silk speak as eloquently as flesh. If Lady Dai's body was a miracle of endurance, then the manuscripts and objects buried with her were a miracle of memory. To step into her tomb is not only to see flesh preserved, but thought, belief, and imagination bound up in silk and lacquer. Tonight, you and I will unroll those scrolls, open those boxes, and listen to the whispers of a 2,000-year-old household. Among the most astonishing finds were silk manuscripts, fragile, delicate, and yet still legible after centuries underground. Their brushstrokes spoke of medicine, lists of herbs, decoctions, treatments for common ailments. Some scrolls described exercises, figures drawn in, flowing poses, bending and stretching, as though tracing energy through the body. Scholars later connected these to early forms of Qigong. Picture Lady Dai, perhaps urged by her physicians, practicing gentle movements in her courtyard, arms raised, knees bent, breath steady. It's a little like stumbling onto an ancient YouTube fitness channel, except, instead of upbeat music and yoga mats, you had silk scrolls and attendants politely looking away. Other manuscripts mapped the heavens. Painted star charts showed constellations arrayed across silk, dots connected in patterns that mirrored order on Earth. The hand believed that heaven and humanity were entangled. If the emperor ruled justly, the stars aligned. If not, comets flashed their disapproval. These maps were not idle doodles. They were cosmic GPS, designed to guide both rulers and souls. For Lady Dai, the charts may have promised that her journey after death would be just as orderly as the stars above. And then came the great T-shaped silk banner. To unroll it is to feel time peel away. At its bottom, mourners bow around her coffin, sleeves trailing like waves. In the middle, Lady Dai herself rises, serene and painted in silk robes, guided by attendants. At the top, celestial beings, suns and moons await her. This was not art for galleries. It was a prayer in color, a roadmap of eternity. Even now, its reds and blacks remain vivid, its message intact. Grief gives way to ascent, sorrow to continuity. The tomb also held lacquerware of staggering quality, trays, bowls, and boxes, painted with curling motifs of clouds and vines. Their surfaces polished as if artisans had just set down their brushes. Some still carried traces of food, grains, meats, fruits, reminders that even in death, Lady Dai was to be nourished. These objects reveal a culture where practicality and beauty were inseparable. A bowl wasn't just a bowl, it was a canvas for artistry and devotion. Garments, too, filled her chamber. Silk robes embroidered with cranes, phoenixes, and flowers, folded as though awaiting her hand. Imagine the rustle of those fabrics, the shimmer under lantern light, the promise of beauty extending into forever. Cosmetics accompanied them: mirrors, powders, oils, perfumes. In the Han imagination, even in the afterlife, you should look presentable. Apparently, eternity had a dress code. And muse always music. Instruments rested in silence beside her coffins. Zithers, bells, flutes. Though unplayed for millennia, their presence promised that her soul would never travel without melody. To the Han, harmony was not just a sound but a state of existence. By placing instruments in her tomb, her family ensured she could carry harmony into eternity. Together, these objects form not just a museum collection, but a portrait of care. Each one says, she was loved, she was honored, she was not sent into silence alone. And each one also says something about us, that human beings, across time, cling to beauty, order, and memory as ways to outlast themselves. But even with scrolls, banners, vessels, robes, and instruments laid bare, Lady Dai's greatest legacy may be less about what she preserved and more about what she taught. For in the end, her story is not only about science or art, but about humility, about remembering that mystery has its place beside knowledge. And that is where we must go next, to her legacy itself, to what it means for us to stand before a woman who should have vanished but did not, and to wonder what endurance and memory truly mean. So here we are, at the final turn of our lantern-lit walk, where Lady Dai is no longer only a marvel of preservation or a showcase of Han artistry, but a mirror held up to us. What do we see when we look at her not only as a body, but as a legacy? First, we see fragility. Lady Dai was not a mythic figure immune to human ailments. She lived richly, yes, but her arteries narrowed, her heart weakened, her breath grew shallow. She died of conditions that we still wrestle with today: heart disease, high blood pressure, the quiet damage of indulgence. In this way, she feels closer, not distant, a noblewoman, but also a patient whose body told the same story many of ours will. Fragility is the universal language, and yet we also see endurance. Against every rule of biology, her body endured. Skin still soft, joints still flexible, organs still intact after 2 millennia. She defied decay not because she was powerful in life, but because devotion, ritual, and chance conspired to protect her. She became the paradox of history: fragile in life, indomitable in death. Science gained much from her. Physicians examined her organs as though she had been wheeled in from a ward yesterday. They confirmed ancient heart disease, mapped her veins, even identified her blood type. She provided the first medical case study that spanned millennia. Through her, we learned that what afflicts us now afflicted those in silk-robed courts as well. Disease does not care for rank, it is the great equalizer. But she gave more than data. She gave perspective. Her manuscripts taught us how the Han thought about the body and cosmos. Her banner taught us how grief could be painted into hope. Her lacquerware taught us that beauty was a daily language, not a luxury. She reminded us that people across time sought the same things we do: health, meaning, dignity, continuity. And then comes humility. For despite every test and analysis, no one can fully explain her preservation. Why her, and not her husband or son? Why did the liquid cradle her instead of corroding her? Why did the seals hold so perfectly when others failed? Scholars circle the questions but never close the circle. And perhaps that is her last lesson: that knowledge has edges, and beyond those edges lies mystery. You and I breathe slowly with this thought. History is not only the catalogue of answers, it is also the keeper of questions. Lady Dai whispers across 2,000 years that some things are not to be solved, but to be carried. Like a lantern in the dark, the mystery itself is what lights our way. So picture the hillside once more. The drums have faded, the mourners have gone, the earth is smoothed, the grass grows. Inside, Lady Dai rests, her chamber sealed. For centuries she remains there, untouched, until modern hands pry open the silence and meet her gaze. And now her story flows through us, half patient, half teacher, wholly unforgettable. When you think of memory, do you imagine carved stones and history books? Or perhaps the soft hand of a woman who refused to vanish? When you think of endurance, do you imagine power and conquest? Or perhaps silence itself? Lady Dai leaves us with these questions, not as riddles to frustrate, but as companions to keep. And with that, we let the lanterns dim, the fan hum softly, and the night gather us in. May your dreams be gentle, your breathing easy, and may the mysteries you carry guide you kindly into sleep.